From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Earlier this year, President Trump and much of the new administration took to the stage at a major conservative conference in Washington, D.C. But despite an all-star lineup, the most memorable moment came when Elon Musk, still a White House insider back then, introduced a man most Americans probably hadn't heard of.
Who else is here?
President Milei has a gift for me.
Javier Milei from Argentina. You guys know who that is, right?
Cue the 54-year-old president of Argentina, Javier Milei, who strides onto the stage with his trademark shock of dark hair and epic sideburns, wielding a huge red chainsaw, which he presents to Elon Musk.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw!
The chainsaw for bureaucracy and for slashing public spending. Milei's Argentina providing a template for Musk's Doge. But, rather like Doge, the experiment hasn't completely gone to plan.
Argentina is in an economic crisis. Growth is slowing. Inflation is ticking up. The peso has come under attack.
Luckily for President Milei, an economic lifeline is on its way.
President Trump has announced a $20 billion bailout for Argentina.
Argentina is one of the most beautiful countries that I've ever seen. We want to see it succeed. It's very simple.
But there's a catch. President Trump says he'll only cough up the cash if his friend Javier Milei wins the midterm elections in Argentina this weekend.
He may win and he may not win, but I think he's going to win. And if he wins, we're staying with him, and if he doesn't win, we're gone.
Is Donald Trump attempting to buy a democratic election? Does his isolationist America First agenda even allow for a $20 billion bailout to Argentina? The story today: why Trump is trying to sway Argentina's election.
We have midterm elections coming up this weekend, not normally something that we would focus on, but it's being portrayed as make or break for the Argentinian president, Javier Milei, not just by people in Argentina, but also by the United States, that is really putting a big bet that Milei will do well in these elections.
That's Stephen Gibbs, who covers Latin America for The Times. In the run-up to these elections, he's been in the Argentinian capital, Buenos Aires, a lot, talking to people and attending some of the huge rallies that Milei's been holding.
They're a reminder that there are probably no other political leaders or presidents in the world quite like Javier Milei. He sees himself not just as a political leader, but as a rock star. And in fact, he used to be the lead singer in an amateur rock group in Argentina. And that is what some of these rallies are like. Quite extraordinary. The one I saw, he sort of crowd surfed through thousands of people, got up on stage, belted out a few Argentinian rock anthems. He's got a pretty good voice. His look is actually partly based on the Rolling Stones. His group was a Rolling Stones cover band. Definitely 70s haircut, leather jacket. His critics, of course, say that Argentina would be much better off if he'd stuck to his original job. But many leaders in the world would claim they're iconoclastic, but he really is the real thing.
Stephen, just talk us through Donald Trump's interest in Argentina. You know, we hear so much about his policy of America First. Why is he offering money to his friend in Buenos Aires?
I think there are many reasons. I think one is that the United States feels that in this region, in the Americas, it wants to make sure as many countries as possible, really all countries is the plan, are on the US side. And they're a bit worried about what's happening in Argentina, where they have an absolutely key ally. I mean, there's hardly anyone in the region who is as close to Trump in many ways as President Milei. But he's in trouble, and the trouble is something that the United States thinks it can fix because he's running out of money to prop up the local currency, the peso, and the country with no shortage of dollars to help out is the United States. I mean, another message that the United States has made is that it's all very well being isolationist, but if you sort of don't keep your eye on what's happening in these countries, particularly their economies, then it costs you more in the long run. I mean, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made this point, when you have an economy that completely collapses, which is pretty much what's been seen in Venezuela, then, you end up with a failed state. And he said, we'd rather spend the money now making sure that an economy becomes stable than end up shooting drug boats in the sea, as he put it. Specifically also in Argentina, which makes it attractive to the United States, is it does have very significant lithium and rare earth reserves. And that's something that the US is in competition with China to acquire. So to have a friendly government and a friendly president ruling a country which has something that the United States really wants, that's also a logic behind this unusual support for the government of President Milei.
What exactly are the terms of the deal, though? What's on offer?
It's as much as $40 billion. $20 billion of that is a swap line, as they call it, for the United States, which really means that the US is open to offer to buy pesos and for the Argentinians to borrow dollars. There's also a further $20 billion, which the US is trying to get private banks and private investors to provide to further prop up the reserves of Argentina. Now, the US says this is a commercial deal. This is because it thinks that Argentina and under Javier Milei is a good bet and it will make money from this deal.
So they are expecting the money back?
They certainly are. That's what the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has made clear. He thinks that the peso, Argentina's currency, is undervalued and therefore buying it will make him money. But there aren't a whole lot of investors that agree with that, which is why the peso is going down in value.
And so a lot of people see this effectively as a bailout that probably won't get paid back at some point unless there's a miraculous recovery. And just for a sense of context, explain why Argentina so desperately needs this lifeline.
Well, Argentina has this sort of unusual situation where it's a country where everyone really sort of thinks in dollars in terms of the value of anything. So if you're selling a house or buying a car, the price is always in dollars. But it also has its own currency, the peso. And it's got this constant friction where that peso, the local currency, is always very vulnerable. Argentina does have the unfortunate reputation of having the world record for sovereign defaults, 9 to date. And it's had, since 1958, 23 IMF bailouts. So it finds it really difficult to buy dollars. So it's constantly caught between a rock and a hard place economically. And whenever things look like they're going wrong, everyone runs for the door and the price crashes. And that's what we've seen in recent weeks in Argentina.
And that's why it's so risky for international institutions to invest in Argentina. And it's such a risk for America to be doing so. And I think in a way that's probably why people are asking questions about America's motives in this. Because this isn't an entirely unconditional loan.
The United States has indicated that this loan depends on Milei doing well electorally. Now, they haven't been completely clear about which election they're talking about, whether that is the election coming up this weekend, which are these midterms for seats in the Congress, or the next big election, which is 2027 Milei's presidential elections.
And that's the remarkable part. So much of this does seem to be dependent on one man and Donald Trump's absolute conviction that he's the man who should be running Argentina. So I suppose to understand how all of this has come about, we really need to know a bit more about Javier Milei. Tell us about him. What's his background?
Milei was born in Buenos Aires to a middle-class family. His father was actually started his career as a bus driver, but then later became quite a successful businessman, actually running a bus company in the capital. Milei had an unusual childhood. He sort of completely fell out with his parents. He's alleged his father was a sort of abusive man, and he totally distanced himself from his parents for 10 years. He became very close to his sister, who he said sort of protected him from this sort of aggressive father in particular. Then in the 80s, when Argentina was having, yet another of its currency collapses and economic problems, he became somewhat obsessed with economics and began studying it very closely. He also then was in the banking sector, and lots of people I've met have said that he's an absolutely obsessive character, absolutely obsessive about his work, would work crazy hours, would be an absolute perfectionist, not indolent in any way, and rather unlike many previous Argentinian presidents.
How does he go from being an incredibly conscientious worker in a bank to being a well-known person on the Argentinian stage?
He got picked up by radio stations and television stations as a pundit who was very critical of the Peronist governments, the sort of big state governments that have dominated Argentinian politics for much of the last 75 years. And he was a very entertaining character in these television studios with his kind of wild haircut and his use of swear words that he had to be sort of beeped out constantly on these shows. I mean, at one stage he smashed a piñata, which supposedly represented Argentina's central bank. Another time he turned up looking like a masked, costumed figure he called General ANCAP, the sort of operatic character who was leader of the fictitious Liberland, a country without any taxes at all. Absolutely sort of passionate that the problems of Argentina were caused by a big government, big state, messing everything up. And the only solution was his really radical one, which he describes as being anarcho-capitalist, whereas the free market completely should dominate everything. The state should withdraw. You should get rid of all the ministries, as many as you can. All benefits really were unnecessary. And this was good television, and it became attracted to the voters, also at the same time through a really clever social media campaign. And his most memorable prop of all of them, of course, was the chainsaw. Which he actually was a functioning chainsaw at many of his rallies, where he would say, "This is how I'm going to tear down state spending."
Foto del estado que tenemos hoy. Muy deporte, afuera. Ministerio de Cultura, afuera.
So he reached all these corners of Argentina and made them go out and vote. And there was this huge sort of anti-government vote that elected this very unusual leader who had almost no political experience.
Tell us a bit about that. What was it that made Argentinians vote for him? What was going wrong with the country, and what was his great promise?
The most tangible problem in 2023, when Milei was campaigning, was inflation. It was close to 200% a year, prices going up by 50% every month. People were finding basic things unaffordable. There was also a feeling that the Peronists were under Cristina Kirchner were corrupt. There was a trial against her. There was this big feeling, which has happened all over the world, that the time was ready for something new. And there was Milei saying, forget all these half-hearted measures that this country's been before. We need to actually tear down the state. We need to burn down the central bank. We need to dollarize, he promised. And millions of Argentinians thought it's worth taking a risk on it.
Wow. I mean, in a way, that's a much more exaggerated form of what was happening in America. People feeling that the cost of living was really biting, and a sense that the incumbent presidency hasn't done enough. How similar is he actually to Trump? I mean, both in style and in substance, in what they stand for.
In substance, there's some big differences. I mean, Trump, of course, is very pro-tariffs, which is an anti-free market approach. Milei, ideologically, believes that, the market should dictate absolutely everything. So there's a big difference there. Also, Milei is a well-trained economist. He really understands economics, which is not Trump's background at all. Where they're similar is this feeling that state spending needs to be cut back. Milei has done that much more sort of dramatically again than Trump has. He's cut 9 ministries. Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Women's Rights. There's also this kind of iconoclastic thing that the formalities of a traditional politician, the art of diplomacy, all of that's out of the window. Both of them seem to say what they think, which is very attractive to their followers and sort of unnerving for their critics.
And is it popular?
It's a mixed result, as we've seen in the elections. No question that Milei's popularity is dropping, but there's a hard core of his support, and it's still, over 40% of the country probably. And what he will say is, look, I set out to cut inflation, and I have done that. It's now way down to around 50% annually, which is, might seem high in global terms, but in Argentinian terms, that's a big cut. The fact that he's cut inflation and balanced the books in Argentina for the first time in more than 15 years, those two successes have made him a hero for the right. Elon Musk called him a beacon of hope. President Trump has said he's a hero. Kemi Badenoch said he's a template for all conservative leaders. The problem is that a lot of people say that on this altar of cutting inflation, there's been a lot of pain, and 18 months in, how long can we sustain that pain? The big problem has been that because he's propped up the value of the peso, one of the consequences of that is that imports become quite cheap, which keeps inflation down, but it does mean that it's much cheaper to buy a television or a pair of jeans online from abroad than buy it locally. So we've seen unemployment go up in all these places like clothing manufacturers in the province of Buenos Aires, and a lot of unhappiness there. And one consequence of that is that the people in that province, they are starting to vote against Milei.
Stephen, you've been telling us about this iconoclastic leader, Javier Milei, and how he's been going about the job of governing in Argentina. The economy hasn't quite gone to plan. There are still question marks, which is clearly why a bailout is now needed. And aside from the economic issues, there have been some pretty big scandals too.
Yes, I mean, it's worth remembering Milei, one of the reasons he got elected was he portrayed the entire political class in Argentina with some evidence as being corrupt. It was a very sort of Trumpian message that he needed to drain the swamp. And everyone thought this eccentric leader, the one thing he wasn't at all was corrupt. Now, that message has been falling apart a bit this year. In February, there was a scandal where Milei promoted a crypto coin called Libra. He sort of tweeted about it or posted it on Instagram. The value of that coin went from naught to $5 in 40 minutes. The people who backed it made between sort of $70 and $100 million, and then it collapsed completely. And a lot of people were, a lot of people lost a lot of money. Now, Milei sort of said that he didn't realize quite what he was promoting or what he was posting, but that, made people begin to ask questions. Then there's another issue around his sister, Karina Milei, absolutely sort of key part of his government, pretty much head of his presidential office, who travels with him the whole time. There were some recordings leaked where the head of a disability agency was indicating that 3% of money for this agency was being offered as a bribe or received as a bribe by her. She's denied it, Milei has denied it, but that again made people wonder just what was going on. And most recently, Milei ally, who was going to be a candidate in these forthcoming elections, he had to stand down after alleged links with drug trafficking. So that's all sort of dirtied the waters to a certain extent.
And that's all being tested this weekend in these midterm elections. Just talk us through the numbers. I mean, how many seats are actually up for grabs, and how much of a difference would it make to him if he was to lose them? How difficult does it become to do business?
So it's half the seats in the lower house and a third of the Senate up for grabs. And, if Milei does well, then he will have a much better chance in what remains, the 2 years that remains of his presidency, to get through these reforms. Milei's personal popularity is slipping. It's still pretty solid in global terms of around 40%. But what we've seen, and the evidence of that, was a provincial election in Buenos Aires, which happened last month. Milei's party only got 34%, and the Peronists, the sort of broadly leftist coalition that is his opponent and has ruled the country in various ways for most of the last 75 years, they were close to 20% ahead. So that was a bit of a wake-up call, and it was that actually which spooked the markets to a certain extent. So he's portraying this as make or break. The United States is as well, and that does seem to be the situation. So let's see how it turns out this weekend.
And Stephen, you mentioned his opposition, the left-leaning Peronists. What's their argument going into this election? Because, obviously they weren't very popular before he came to power. How are they campaigning, especially with Donald Trump's threat of pulling money? How are they getting around that?
I think their main argument is one that resonates across the country, and that is that, okay, he may have solved inflation, congratulations, but people are feeling the pain and they need to see real results. But there is another side of that, and that is that Peronism, this movement that has run the country for so long, remains unpopular amongst a large amount of Argentinians. They look at a country, and this is a message that Milei hammers home the whole time, that 100 years ago was one of the richest in the world and was on sort of track to become at least a Canada or Australia of the 20th and 21st century, and it clearly isn't. Milei's argument that if you don't have me, it's back to the bad old days, that is one that's still very powerful in the country.
This is Argentina confronting what has been a problem for much of South America. You have this sort of left-wing anti-American bias versus an increasingly sort of right-wing politics that's taking over. And in a way, that's probably why Donald Trump is so interested in this election. I mean, just stepping back, talk us through the shift across the region.
In Latin America, you have this sort of near constant pendulum from the left to the right and then to the left again. Right now, it does seem to be heading towards the right. We've just had elections last weekend in Bolivia, where a centrist won the presidential race. It looks like there might be a right-wing shift in both Chile and Colombia next year. We've got populist right-wing leaders, not only Milei, but in El Salvador, we have Bukele. In Ecuador, we have Noboa. There's also sort of anti-incumbent trend generally, which is something that Milei benefited from. I think the message, of course, you're getting from the Trump administration is that we do not really want anyone who is at all anti-American in power in the Americas. So we're going to work quite hard to ensure that that doesn't happen.
And that sort of explains their actions in Venezuela too. And we've done a podcast on that recently. So if listeners want to go back and find some of the background, that is available in our feed. Why is South America sort of the exception to everything Donald Trump pitched for MAGA? It's America first, ending wars. With Venezuela, he seems to be starting one. And with Argentina, this is a bailout at a time when a lot of Americans aren't being paid because of the government shutdown. Is that going to be a problem for him?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things going on at the same time here. One is this idea that you shouldn't have any anti-American governments of any ilk, really, in the region. And that's quite attractive to Trump's voter base, particularly, looking at the case of Venezuela, where, you have a very strongly anti-American government there. And one of the consequences of its rule is you've had massive migration. So sort of fixing that problem is attractive to some Trump voters. But yeah, you're right. It also there's a contradiction because at the same time, there's an isolationist feeling in the United States. And for the US to be pumping $20 billion into a country right at the other end of the Americas is quite a hard sell for some in the MAGA base. Fortunately, perhaps Milei helps sort of bridge that problem because he is an attractive figure for those people who, feel that a new generation of politicians should be sort of totally tearing down the old. And that's what Milei stands for. And of course, what Trump does at the same time. So there is a meeting of minds there, despite this rather unusual thing of spending US dollars to help support a president right at the other end of the continent.
That was Stephen Gibbs, Latin America and Caribbean contributor for The Times and The Sunday Times. The producer today was Olivia Case, with help from Alula Hart. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.